Hey,
Hello, how's it going?
so far so good. I send you some crazy code example in the
On Teams via email.
on Teams.
Uh,
One of the challenge I have is, for example, if you have two observable counters, one is the user time, another is the system time, but you only
okay.
have this call that you can repeat both. I was trying to find out an efficient way that we can make only one syscall and push that. There might be other ways, but I have some idea.
Okay.
Hey
What?
guys, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying what was odd is that I didn't like I see all your messages here on Teams, but it didn't make the conversation, black and bold like it normally does, unless I just accidentally clicked on it at some point. I didn't
Probably
realize there was anything here.
I should be on Slack.
Anyway, now that I know that there's a message there, I will definitely read it.
Let's wait for a couple minutes for people to join.
All right.
And meanwhile, please put your name in the attendees list.
Yes.
So there's one non-blocking comment in the previous PR that I merged. I think it was brought by Noah. And the question is, in the instrument creation, the current approach that I already merged, we suggest that when people create the instrument, they can optionally provide a list of attribute names and types, but we didn't see anything about the value. And when Noah was trying to compare what we have in OpenTelemetry versus what Prometheus client has, it seems Prometheus client has multiple ways of people putting static labels. They can put that on a higher level, similar like the meter provider level. They can also put that at the meter level and also instrumentation level. So that brings the question, if we have a goal to be able to cover the Prometheus scenario, do we think we want to provide the same static attributes capability? And then that brings to more questions here. So is that a static thing that will act as a constant, we never change, or it's something we just give a default value and people can still override that thing? So want to bring this topic here and see, number one, would people think that's a blocking issue? Number two, what's the preference here? So instead of making this very abstract conversation, I'll try to show what we mean here. Let me pick the current spec. And meanwhile, Noah, if you have anything to add, please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think my most immediate suggestion was that the spec already has a line in it that says that there's a parameter that takes a list of names and types. And so my most immediate suggestion is, until we have defined a behavior for the thing, then we shouldn't put it in the spec.
Yeah,
because at the
that makes
moment
sense.
we could just use it for anything. Like it has no defined meaning.
Yeah.
And then the next step is now to decide, do we want a thing, and if we do, what behavior should it have?
Yeah, it makes sense. So I can explain what was in my mind when I put this up, and then we can talk about whether people think that makes sense, or we should remove that, or we want to remove that for now and later we add it back, or we want to clarify the semantic. So what I was thinking is for the metrics API, in some situation, people want to have better performance. In this way, they might want to give some hint while they create this instrument. So the example I give here is when people create the counter, they can actually say, hey, I want this counter to be a double value, and I can provide some information here. So you know, I'll have, like, I must have one dimension, which is the customer. And this is the attribute. So the name is customer and the value is a string. And I also can put some additional things. Say this is high cardinality. So if you want to do some aggregation in the IC, you have to prepare for plenty of memory. This is what I think can give people better opportunity to bring some like performant implementation. But I agree, it was never clarified in this part. So my number one question is, do people think we should have this and clarify this, or we think if it's not clear, we should simply remove this and not block on this? My take would be, I think it's valuable, and I would prefer to clarify this instead of removing it, but want to see the other's opinion.
Could you discuss a little bit about the value and default value and what your intention there would be?
I think we haven't yet covered the default value one. We're talking about, do we think we want to provide an optional list of attribute here or not at all? If not at all, then everything will be runtime. So for every individual counter call, when you try to call the counter and say add something, you provide the attributes and everything is dynamic. There's nothing predefined there. But if you have this optional list, you can say, hey, I want to create this counter. And I can tell the counter ahead of time, I'll have 3 dimensions. Although that doesn't mean you cannot provide extra dimension later, but it actually gives you better performance. And also you can put some enforcement saying, hey, this dimension, like the customer, is a string. So if someone is passing a non-string, you might make some language trick to prevent them from doing that.
Yeah. So when I first saw this, I was imagining in my mind that this would be our way in to replace the bound instruments that was in the previous spec, where in the bound instrument in the previous spec, you actually have to make another call to do the binding, whereas my impression in here is that when you create the counter, you already provided, quote, a set of bound labels.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I was thinking about it, but yeah,
it
Right.
could be used for that, but might not be limited to that.
Wait,
right. And thus the bounding would imply some value, and thus I was asking what the intention here was.
So I would like to understand a bit, Victor, to your point, what exactly is these attributes for right now?
So I think there's a couple of different opinions, but in my, original or reading this is that I thought it would be, similar to how we're doing the bound instruments today or in the previous spec or whatever spec we have. And here is that when you create your counter, I already have some set of known key value pairs that I want to always include.
Right.
So that when I do that, when I create the instrument, then later on, when I add the measurements, I don't have to provide that. So this is akin to what Noah's thinking about the static, labels.
Yeah, I was under the impression the same, more of like this is a list of constant labels that apply to all the recordings, but not limited to that. So there are other attributes or labels coming while you are doing the recordings. This is just on top of that. I do believe that we better remove this. Smaller API is better, I would say, and maybe we can discuss adding it later. My 2 cents on this.
So my worry is if we add that later, that might surprise a lot of implementations, like when people make the IC. So I would rather we have a clear thinking. If we remove that, we're not going to add it at least this year before we stabilize the metrics API. or we'll remove that for now, and after we finish the SDK, like the spec, we're going to come back. So just have some idea about that would help.
So right now, what I would do right now, I would remove it, but I would add a sentence there that the API must be designed in a way that allows us to add extra optional things in the future. So that makes things clear for the way how you design the API in different languages, that you either use a builder or you use a var-args things in Golang or whatever you do, but the way how it is, it should be backwards compatible, the capability to add extra arguments to that constructor.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then the next level question is, do you think when we remove that, we're going to need that very soon? I mean,
not very soon, not very soon. I don't think we had it in our API, in the previous API definition, and we survived pretty well. A bunch of times, a lot of these things were added as resources or what we have in the instrumentation library name and stuff. So a bunch of times, what I'm trying to say, majority of the use cases, they may be covered by the current resource and instrumentation library name. But I may be wrong. I'm happy to be wrong and hear from somebody.
Oh, it's fine. I'll send a PR and explain what we discussed here and why we're removing it, and then I'll bring this topic to see if any other folks see the potential issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with what Bogdan just proposed there. I might caveat. I mean, how would people feel if we added a sentence that said language implementers are, basically allowed to create performance optimizations if it doesn't constrain the ability to specify, the labels dynamically at the call site? I don't know if that's too vague language or.
What do you try to achieve? Before adding that sentence, I would like to understand what you try to achieve, because that sentence may open too much.
Okay.
Open too many possibilities.
Sure.
That I'm not saying is not good. I'm just saying that
Right.
let's make sure whatever we allow kind of a limited scope for that.
Sure. So this is, well, I guess two things. One is I don't have any strong urgency around it. So if you just say, let's not do it, I'm not going to be unhappy. This was more me trying to facilitate what I think Riley was aiming for. And I think what Riley was aiming for was, if the API gives users an option to declare in advance the shape of their dimensions or a subset of their dimensions, and the users opt to make use of that facility, then they might be able to have faster performance when they log measurements.
I see. So I don't think the use case of fully defined labels, I don't believe in that, but I do believe in the other use case, which is defining the keys in advance, and you add only the values when you record, and have a index matching, like first value belongs to the first key and so on. That
keys is what I meant.
Okay, so that is different than having a full of all the attributes.
Right. Agreed.
So the whole attributes is different, because then you have the values and the keys and the values.
Yep.
So these
So currently it's the attribute names and types. I think given
it's
the
just
names,
the keys.
Yeah, and giving the type might have some benefit for strong type languages that they
Oh,
can.
no. Yeah. So what you want actually here is not attribute names and types, because as I read it initially, I read it as being attributes, full attributes, like maybe
Right.
my mistake on how I read it, but the way how I read it was you want to declare the full attributes, like foo equals bar, and that will be added to every point on top of whatever you define during the add operation. So for example, you have you define here foo bar, and during add you have bar equals buzz, so you end up with 2 dimensions instead of this. Okay, so if this is your goal, this is a bit different than what I believed.
I don't think it was Riley's goal. I think it may have been Victor's goal. Like different people are interpreting the same sentence differently, which is part of the reason why I wanted to get it clarified.
Yeah, so I'll clarify. So my goal is I want to give people a predefined names and types, so they don't have to specify the name. They can leverage some like sequencing or the language own way of specifying the named parameter. So they can only specify the value without putting the name over and over again. And that's for performance reason.
Okay.
And Victor's goal is different, and it's not in the spec at all. It's an optional list of attributes. That means the names and the values. So it's more like something applied to all the subsequent calls, which is not here. And I'm willing to explore both. I think we just talked about we don't need either of them. We can remove the entire thing. But now it seems there might be a scenario where people want to prefer the attribute name and value or not.
No, so what I'm trying to say first, so I think there are multiple use cases where you provide keys and values. So
right, I listed 4 in my PR.
Yeah, so one of them would be
these are the constant key value pairs, the default one, and
so I don't. We had that default hint thingy before, and we removed it because it was very confusing. FYI, just we got a lot of feedback about that being very confusing for users. So this optimization, by the way, with predefining the keys, and in order to allow you to specify only the values and avoid constructing complicated object and maybe deal with a bunch of things, I think it will be an interesting optimization that we may achieve good things. So
one example I put here, you can see, like, imagine a strong type language. I can even define some structure here and just use that when I create the counter, and gives you the semantic, like the type, which one is required, which one is not. And you can simply create this strong type and pass in the counter, which is very convenient. Not necessarily, I think no one might disagree with me. Like .NET probably would never do this, but certain situation people might find it helpful.
Can I have a
Go ahead.
Sorry, can I have a question around this? So instead of like letting the users to basically provide any type for the attributes of the counter, for example, in this case, the power consumption object, would not it be easier to just define the attribute object and also let the instruments or the meters basically receive a, I don't know, attribute provider, so that you will be able to have any arbitrary object that basically you can like say that, hey, I have this object, you can have a builder for that and so on. And you can convert that into this list of attributes, because you need to implement the, I don't know, attribute provider interface or somewhat. But on the API side, it will never know about like what is it under the hood. It will only know that it is something that will provide me attributes.
But we need the quality operation on that.
What does that mean?
We need the ability to compare them. Even though it's opaque, because you need to build a map of dimensions or attributes.
Yeah, but you would not compare these objects. You would compare the attributes that these objects will give you, right? And those should be comparable.
Sure. Okay, so you kind of want to have a delayed attribute or whatever.
It's something like that, which basically prevents the API or protects the API knowing about anything else than just, hey, I need a set of attributes. And it doesn't really matter how the user will provide that to the API. The API will never know anything else, just a list of attributes or set of attributes. And having like this provider interface will make the user able to do this, that they have a type object or like a type class, and they will be able to like fill it out, do some validation on top of it, and so on. And at the end, when they will pass this provider to the API, it will just get the list of attributes out of it, and it will work with that afterwards. And this,
Jonathan, the one I like the idea. I think the original goal is just a question of performance. So I don't know what we're trying to go is. Is it just pure performance in passing, or is it flexibility in passing? So I think there's two different versions.
Performance. My starting point is that if you know some dimensions ahead of time, you specify the names, then the actual implementation can do a lot of optimization. They might say, oh, this is a 3-dimension thing. I'll just pre-allocate this memory for you. If I see anything else, I can do the runtime dynamic thing, but by default, I'll optimize for this fixed dimension.
Yeah, so you can do a lot of optimization, but I don't think you can do unless we require that if you define 3-dimension names, types, or whatever you define there, you only accept 3. So I think if you allow people to pass you more than just the 3 that you get into the constructor, you need to give them another way to pass these extra things, and then you lose a lot of the performance that you gain.
Yeah, it's more like optimizing the fixed part. If people passing dynamic thing, it's okay to slow down a little bit and do actual allocation or do something. But
may I say one thing? I think we're straying from what the real the issues is. There's 2 issues here. The first issue is the performance and how we pass that and how we do with that. I think that's secondary. The first problem I think it's much more important is whether or not we allow people to provide a set of values when they create the metrics. And if we don't do that, then it actually has ramifications in how people instrument their code. And to Noah's point and others' point before is that if you're coming from Prometheus, the code pattern that you put in has always been based on the availability feature is that some portion of your code, some context, so you could create a meter based on that context. Some later time in your code, when you're adding the measurements, you may not have access to those contexts. So in that fashion, having these name value pairs pre-created with the counter is a useful pattern.
But it's not created with the counter. So I think there is a small difference between our instrument counter versus Prometheus. So Prometheus has this notion of counter vec, I think it's called, or something like that. That that is a bit different than the counter. So the counter is just the definition of the metric, no labels, no nothing. So here it is. Now, from this counter, you can have an add method, or we can build extra things. Let's say partial. We have in the previous definition of the API, we have bind, which is fully bind. You cannot have anything, but we can have a partial bind, for example, that resolves your stuff, correct? But you still need, Victor, in this case, this is something that I don't know why Prometheus does this way, and maybe you can give me some example, is you still need to pass that partial or partial resolve meter or counter vec in Prometheus between the moment when you have the context and the moment when you do the measurement. So why you cannot pass the context, but you can pass that the other object? It feels to me like, is this just something that people just got used to this fact, or is really a limitation that, because there is a need to pass either the context that you mentioned or the object that you created with these objects from the context, with these things. So somehow you need to pass. Go ahead.
So I believe what you described is exactly what Josh asked. And he asked explicitly, like, the API must allow the callers to provide flexible attributes, because the argument here is we allow context and baggage and other stuff. We shouldn't limit the functionality. So here, I'm giving an example. You have the predefined this type that you can report that efficiently, but you still have the flexibility here. You can put whatever key value pair. And this is what he tried to improve based on the Prometheus API.
So that's cool. But I think what we can do, and how I would think about this API. So we have a counter, and now on the counter you can create bindings or bounds, things that are fully fleshed. So you tell me all the label key all the attribute key values or the attributes, and you can just do add and decrement in case of the other. But let's say we just do add for the moment. Okay, this is one type. We can add another type of partial or whatever, partial bind or whatever we call it, full partial thing that does what Victor wants, which is you provide half of the things. We can have another one which is optimized bound, which you or optimized thing that provides only the keys. And in this thing, when you do add, you have just to provide the values. So we can give users more options to achieve the same thing with different performance guarantees.
My worry is this is becoming too complex.
You think?
I think this is already like very, very hard to understand. And if we go down this path, this will be like, we haven't seen that in the other very successful metrics API. So that's why I'm a little bit scared. So how about this? So we decided like the performance thing can be added, like Bogdan, you mentioned previously. If we allow this optional input, we can add that later. It's additive change, not going to break the existing APIs. If we do need that, we can do that later. So what my suggestion is, we can remove that for now. And probably you don't need that for.
Yeah. So what I think for that API, what I would do from the counter, I would have a method get optimized thingy that provides the list of attribute names and types. And this has an equivalent add method that just accepts the values. We can extend in the future.
I see. Yeah, so you have something like you feed the counter with partial input and you return some intermediate result, and you can keep adding things, and then you get another intermediate result until you fill in everything. And my worry is I haven't seen that in other successful metrics APIs. That's why
Prometheus does. Prometheus does that. Prometheus with Prometheus counter vec thing. That's what it does. So you have a counter, you start from a counter, then you provide five attributes, key values. Then you get another counter vec that all the measurements. Now this counter vec has the same API. You can do add on it without any labels. So Prometheus returns actually the same object. We can do the same trick if we want to not add new concepts and stuff. But that object now, whenever you call add, if you add extra labels, because they call them labels, I think in Prometheus,
Yeah.
it inherits the 5 plus the extra that you have.
I see.
So it is a common pattern in Prometheus, and we can always add that. But let's start with just a simple add, even not bounds yet, because as
Fine by me.
we've proven, we can add them later, and we can have a debate on how to do that nicely for the users. And I would like to see very good performance comparisons, for example, for the only provide me keys, and then you have, let's say, optimize counter, or whatever you call it, that you get from a counter by providing just the keys, and the new API that this one has allows you to provide only the values. So let's stick with minimal. Minimal is always better. We can always add, but please make sure you add that sentence that I mentioned to you, that we need to, especially the creation of the instruments, to be flexible, that in the future, if we may need to add new option, the APIs and SDK should not be surprised and should be able to add a new optional parameter to that.
Yeah. So for this one, yeah. So I'll send a PR to remove it for now. And
yeah, but just make sure the way how we design the APIs, and for example, as I said, in Java, that will be a builder, so I can always add a new method, a new argument. But I don't know what others will do, but just make sure we can add optional things. Not required, because required will be breaking change, but optional.
Okay. Yeah, and then last question about this topic. So if we remove that, would anyone saying that this will be a blocker that will bring back, and we have to solve this before we mark the API as stable? It's still complicated, but just want to get that idea.
Not that I foresee.
I'm not.
Stable.
Me neither.
API can become stable. Is it usable by everyone and everyone is happy? Maybe not everyone is happy, and there will be people wanting that. But I think you will.
Oh yeah, I agree. What my point is, we're not going to screw up the API that we already stabilized. We can add additional things, but we're not going to say, oh, we have to rework the API and have a totally different new version. So
as we just discussed, I don't think we need to do that. So for Prometheus style thing, we can easily have a method that says bound some attributes and return the same object, and we just implement the same concept that is in Prometheus. For the keys stuff, we can have a new type that is created as part of the counter, and it's simple. So I don't think anything is blocked.
Cool. I think we're done here. So I'll follow up on that. Thanks, everyone. And any other thing like you want to quickly mention before we move on?
Yeah. So quick thing, and I'm just clarifying. So the statement that we're saying, that Bogdan is saying, am I right to just say that the spec is to specify the minimum required for a stable API, but depending on which language you are, you may be able to add additional idiomatic. No. Okay, so we're not saying that. Okay.
Unless the spec tells you can be creative at certain moment, then otherwise you cannot.
So Victor, our goal is to bring the entire community and everyone to a very minimal and stable level that we can collect feedback, and then we let creativity comes into place and say, okay, we discover that our users have these problems, A and B and C. Let's be creative and solve these problems together and come up with more smarter APIs on top of what we have. Does it make sense?
Sure. No, that's fine. I was just thinking that language implementation may be different, because we talked about it a couple of times, that language specific nature may play a role.
May play, but not by adding completely new concepts. So
I agree.
and functionalities. So that's the whole thing. Like when it comes to new functionality, I don't think that's where we say language has the freedom. We say language has a freedom of following using an option or settings pattern for creating things, or builders, or returning generic versus returning names with a type, because Java is stupid and cannot have primitives, boxed and unboxed things. So a lot of these things are language specific, but not when it comes to functionality. We want the functionality to be defined here. And so unless you add unless you don't add new functionality, then you can be creative. But when it comes to new functionality, we would like to have everyone on the same level, because the problem that we are trying to raise here is if we allow everyone to be creative, we will end up with functionality called foo in C# and called bar in Java, and we'll screw up our users way more than today. So
fair enough.
Okay, so moving on. So the next one is the async counter PR. So last time we have the counter synchronous one got merged. So I'm working on the asynchronous one. Please take a look. And my biggest struggle is the prior art when I look at the observer from this old type and the current, like the API. We have an observer function in the callback where people can call the observer and keep sending the thing. What I'm taking a little bit different approach here by making sure the callback function is returning a list or whatever the language idiomatic way, a collection of the value and the attributes. So this might be a little bit different. I want to get people's idea, and I don't have a strong opinion on either way. So if you see a strong reason why you prefer this way versus the other way, please comment. I'm trying to like dig through the conversation history. I have some basic understanding, but
so this is opposite to the fact that we provided you before. We gave you an result or an updater or whatever.
This is very different. And my major challenge here is if someone like they store the result to a global variable and they call that outside this function, what's the result? I find it very hard to explain the side effect. Or if we can just ignore, like we tell people, if you just store this value somewhere else and you call that outside the function, then screw you up, it's your problem. I'm totally fine with that.
Which value? Sorry, can you repeat?
So this result.observe.
Okay. That's a call on that object. What can you store?
So if someone has a global variable, they store the result. And after this call, in somewhere in another thread, they call the same result.observe. What's the behavior? If we're saying this is their problem, we screw them up, then I'm totally fine.
Sorry, but this is a pattern, a very clear pattern that I'm passing you the object and you call on that object. Sure, it may happen.
So for example, if that function finished, but the user is having some asynchronous call that is still reporting the number, what do we do here? And do we expect this to be, for example, if the observer function is going to call some asynchronous, like they call some sensor, like temperature sensor, it's going to take time, and they have a callback, what do we do? So I found this part for JavaScript is very hard to explain.
Okay, let me give you background why we choose this way versus returning thing, and then we can discuss if one is better or the other. So this pattern was very nice for us because we actually were giving you a fake or an object that actually was embedding directly our SDK implementation thing, and then every time when you call us, we just update the value directly into our maps, and we do a lot of things. So we avoid creating lists or maps. As a result, we just directly, whenever you pass us the result, we update our internal map that we have to produce anyway. So you don't give us a map that will then transform in our internal map and so on and so forth. So it was very interesting and
makes sense
for this reason. Now I understand your problem, and I don't know what is better. I'm just
Yeah, so I guess it might not be a problem because I've seen this pattern somewhere else. Just want to see like if anyone's seeing problem here, because it seems to be fine. I've seen that in Python, in C# people implement this pattern with no problem. So perhaps it's just my like my personal doubt here.
Yeah. This would only apply for C#. It wouldn't necessarily apply elsewhere. Like we could make that result be what's called a ref struct, which are things that are you can only have them on the stack. And thus it would literally be impossible for them to assign it into a global value. The language wouldn't let them do it. But that's specific to C#. I don't think all of our languages have those sorts of tools in their tool bag.
But to be honest, there are a bunch of things that user can screw up, like holding a reference to a span and other things that they can screw up unless they do whatever the documentation says. And I'm pretty confident, even in the core.NET, there are things that user can do stupid if they store
sure.
references to things that they shouldn't store reference to things.
Yeah.
So that being said, I do understand the reason, for example, for something like JavaScript, where maybe it's better to return something than updating. But I also don't understand why it's better to return something than.
Don't know. I just bring this question and see, like totally.
No, but you mentioned that in JavaScript.
Yeah, in JavaScript, a lot of functions are like asynchronous by nature.
Correct.
You can hardly make a blocking API call. In this way, they want to access some sensor, and that's a callback function. They might want to change the entire metric callback function to be asynchronous call. And what does that mean? So it's very hard for me to think about that.
But even the one that you propose, which returns a thing, has to be a blocking, because you have to give me the thing.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So you either make the call for update or whatever you call the call, it has to be blocking. No matter if they update that into a result that I'm passing you as an argument versus you give me a list, the whole function has to be blocking.
Yeah, exactly. But in this way, I make it explicit. But in the observer way, they can make it non-blocking. It seems to be working, but when you dig into that, you see things start to break. In this way,
I see. So I see. By the definition, this one for people is much clearer that it's blocking versus the other one.
Yeah, and we're saying this is not a. I think that might be an oversight. If this is not a problem, totally fine to change that to observer. Just want to see if anyone familiar with this async pattern.
To be honest, I think this is where languages have that freedom of deciding. It's such a similar thing for me. You either give me a map of things, or you put this into an object that I give to you. It's exactly the same thing. Like
yeah. So in this way, like do we want to give some flexibility? We can say like the language can decide if they want to have some helper class, or they can return the entire thing.
I would just clarify if that should be a list or a map. That's the only interesting part, and if that's a map, on what is a map. So yes, I'm happy to give this flexibility, and I think it's right to do it. But the return here, is that a dictionary or a list?
I think technically it is a dictionary, and the key should be the combination of the attributes, and the value is just the value itself. But
it may be good. I mean, but just define that. So we can say that, hey, you have options to pass a result that user can use to update or whatever you call that, or return a map defined like this.
Yeah, and I want to understand why do you see mentioning a dictionary is important? I mean, from semantic, it doesn't make sense for people to report the same attributes but different value. Like if they do that, it's an indication of a bug. But with the observer, they can call the observer several times. by passing the same value again and again, which is also a bug. So it seems there's no real way we can prevent them from doing that.
No, so the one thing that I want is who handles the error. So I want to be consistent somehow of who handles the error in this case. So in case of a result pattern, is our SDK that has to handle the error, correct? In the case of dictionary, if you accept dictionary, is the user who has to handle the error.
Yeah, and even if it's a list, the SDK can go
No,
through the
in
list.
a list is still the SDK who handles the error.
Yeah.
In the map case is the user. So that's why I think it's a subtle difference here. I don't care necessarily, but I think having a bit of consistency that I don't know.
Okay, so the reason I put a list here is because I want that to be the same as the observer semantic. The SDK should be responsible, and the SDK can decide if the duplicated thing is an error. I'll drop the entire data, or the SDK will say
we can
the last one. Yeah, the last one wins or whatever.
Or we can do some sum if this is a sum, or we can do some tricks.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I like the fact that it's a list because it's very, very similar with the results. Like we don't have any dictionary pattern involved. That's why I asked this question. I didn't not ask to change it to a dictionary.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
I was just trying to brainstorm.
Yeah, this is very helpful because I was struggling this at like 1 a.m. literally like today morning on this part. So that solved the biggest question I have. So for the other things, these are small. So please review the PR, and I'll move to the next one.
Just FYI, the C# prototype at the moment, it kind of does both of those things. It has, I mean, I just had 2 different overloads of the constructor that take 2 slightly different callbacks. One callback has that result object that lets you specify as many as you want. And the other one just lets you return, at the moment, it lets you return a single value with the assumption to be that would be a common case that you'd only have one value you wanted to report. And it just makes the syntax really simple if you only have one value that you can just return the one value. I mean, I still feel like that fits within the, languages have some flexibility to sort of do things that appear idiomatic in that language.
Yeah, definitely. I think allowing or specializing for this one case it's okay for me. I don't see a problem. But I would like to, if that was the decision, I would like to maybe have a number of calls of that versus the other, if possible, just for my knowledge and for my to learn new things.
Sorry, what you want to have a number of? I didn't follow you.
A number of how many times the multiple version is used versus how many times the single entry version is used.
Oh, you just mean like in the future, try to get telemetry to understand what the pattern that users prefer?
Is that not available already? Is not available already?
I mean, this is just some code that we wrote in a branch. Nobody's using it.
I see. But still, it would be good to have a telemetry of metrics of how many times that one is used versus the other, just to see if it's such a common use case,
right,
to other languages as well.
I mean, in the future, we can probably get some of that telemetry, or during a preview period, we might just get direct user feedback that says, I liked A or I liked B better, or that they use both,
Or I'm confused about this.
Right. Yeah.
Only one.
Yeah.
No,
so.
Good.
Okay, cool. So moving on now about the project tracking. Sorry, I have too many tabs. So so for the API, I just want to make sure once we have this asynchronous counter. For the asynchronous counter, another thing I want to call it. Currently, I call that observable counter. And the reason I'm calling that is I know there, like in micrometer, people just call that like a gauge. And gauge is more like the observable up-down counter. right? In micrometer, it is the up down, and it is a
in-
callback.
Right, in micrometer, there is a functional counter. That's the asynchronous counter. That's not a gauge. So in micrometer, the counter can only go up. And the asynchronous counter is called functional counter. The gauge, it can go up and down.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, gauge in micrometer is an asynchronous instrument that can go up and down. And
Yes,
it is different from it is very different from the Prometheus gauge, which is the synchronous one, right?
No.
You look at this, like this is from Josh.
No, gauge in Prometheus is very similar with gauge in micrometer, if I'm not mistaken. Both of them have an operation to say plus minus and a set operation on it. I'm pretty confident that both, so micrometer gauge and Prometheus gauge are very similar. That's why we don't want to use gauge in our API, because we will confuse hell out of our users.
Okay, yeah. So probably I'm making a wrong statement, but it seems like what I did, I'm trying to avoid gauge entirely in the API. So I'm trying to call this observable counter. Just try to make sure it's an asynchronous counter.
But
so,
what we call this some observer.
Some observer, yeah. I'm trying to make some correlation so people can understand this is the counter, this is the asynchronous, instead of this is the counter, some observer, and they don't share any common name. So this is the trick I'm trying to do. Want to get feedback. It's very subjective, I understand.
I do understand this. The reason, by the way, telling you the reason why we choose this was because counter is the instrument of counting things. But you are here not observing a counter doing things. You are actually observing the result of a counter, which is a sum.
I understand.
So that was the reasoning behind us calling things sum there. It was more grammar Nazi, and but
yeah, totally. So that part is very subjective, and I want to find a way how people can give feedback. So everyone, please comment and see why you prefer this, and I'll try to push for simplicity. So for people who don't understand the metrics, they're not expert, they come here, once they understand the counter, they have an idea. I have something that's similar to counter, but it's asynchronous. What should I do? Immediately they can translate that to observable counter. And once they learn that, if they have other stuff, there's a pattern for them, instead of they have to understand everything and always have that model in their mind. So this is my goal. Try to make it simple for the user, not for us.
So question, at least in C#, I mean, we keep on talking about, async count, async, whatever. Why not literally just call it async counter?
I try to avoid async at all, because I know many languages, they have the async like terminology for other stuff. It seems like it's a non-blocking API, right? So
it's not necessarily a non-blocking, by the way. It's not an asynchronous execution of things. It's just like the counter is calculated somewhere else, and you are literally observing it whenever you want. So you are literally going and get a snapshot of that counter that happens and is calculated somewhere else, and you are going to observe it. The async part, I don't think we are executing anything async, because in the end, from our SDK, we'll execute that synchronously. Yes, and at an undefined time or whatever, whenever we want, or something like that. But I don't think it's we are scheduling any async work. Maybe I'm wrong, but
I believe to me both observable counter and async counter make sense. And to me, async counter makes sense because it is asynchronous from the user's perspective. So when they increment the counter, that happens asynchronously to them when you use the counter.
I see. So you the async from you comes from the fact that from the user that types the thing is gonna happen asynchronously from.
Yeah, but what you said previously, to me that totally makes sense. So I am fine with both. To me, both make sense, having observable counter and async counter, because from the user perspective.
I try to avoid async because a lot of languages, they have the async concept. They even have the async keyword, and that has a very different semantic.
Yeah, so that may be a good reason to avoid async in that perspective.
And I'm very bad at naming, so this is the best one I could find,
Right.
and try to be creative, but we need to find some name that is best for the user, not for us. That's my key. Okay, so
I think this is very good. The observable counter, I'm fine with. I was fine either with some observer, but clearly that was not people understood. So
yeah, there are too many questions about that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we can move on. So so project tracking, it has been an incomplete list of all the metrics and SDK spec issues. So I'm trying to make sure at least if there's API spec blocking issue, it should show up here. And if it's not here, then that means it's not a problem we're trying to solve in the API spec. So these are some questions I want to have a quick like answer from your guys. So after this is like the observable counter PR, I believe the next thing is we just want to figure out what's the rest, and it should be straightforward. We just copy the existing thing and we change the name and we give some example, then we're done, right? So I believe if this observable counter PR is merged, then the next meeting we're going to figure out what about the rest, and it's just about the names. Do we need this semantic or not? And do we need 6 or 7 or 4? That's the only remaining thing. And I want to make sure the other items are not part of the API spec focus. So for example, this one, currently it is under the metrics API standardization of unit. I believe we already clarified that the API and SDK has no idea about the unit. It's just opaque string. So this shouldn't be a blocking issue. So what I'm going to do is I'll remove this from the project tracking and park this under semantic convention or data model. I'll need to work with Josh to figure out where's the best place. So is that everyone else understanding here?
Fine by
Do you
me.
think there? Sorry, go ahead.
I just said, fine by me. Like I agree with your premise.
Yeah, so my statement is after the observable counter PR is merged, the only remaining thing for the API is we sort out the names. And there's one known issue about the hint. And we agreed last meeting that hint is not something we want to work on right now. We're going to proceed to the SDK spec. And after the SDK spec is there, we already know if people want to provide the bucket size and specify which dimension they want, we can take the learning and come back to the hint API. This is the only thing left, nothing else. Is that correct?
And I'm still not sure if the hint API should be part of creation or can be separate objects associated with that thing. One thing that we did in Open Census and at least in Census internally in Google was very useful. We had these views associated with every instrument, but they were completely different objects and different things, and nobody complained about that. And they had very nice YAML serialization, so people can define them in a YAML file instead of defining them in code, and much easier to change and propagate and so on. So anyway, we can discuss later, but I think it's something that we can postpone.
Quick question. So for the rest of the instruments, do you also want to consider having a time abstraction, like a timer or something?
I think that's probably after we deal with up-down things, and then after we deal with the gauge thing. But yeah, I think at one point it will come on the list.
Okay, cool.
Is it required before 1.0 or stability of the API? I don't think so. I think we can declare stability in a word that we know for sure this API will be stable before having that, because that's an addition, if I'm not mistaken. Correct? Like I'm trying to split things into what is required. We need a full story for counter and maybe for up-down counter and the histogram thing that we had before. If we have these notions, then probably we are done with 90% of the use cases. Then we have timers. People were asking about instruments to count not only durations, but also what was that exceptions thing. They want to have something like language specific stuff, but anyway, we can discuss.
Okay, cool. I think we're on time. Just one quick question. So is there any recommendation where we should park the unit thing, Bogdan? Do you think this is semantic convention, or
what do you mean?
Like, I don't understand why do we want to solve this in the API? I thought we already agreed that API and SDK just treat unit as opaque string. So then I'm trying to give this to some other SIG, and I have a hard time finding out should I put this on Josh's plate or someone else?
I think we can park it for the moment, but I think we will end up having something like what they have there, a list of constants of different units, for time units, for a bunch of other things. We will provide a list of constant units as constant strings, essentially, that people can use easier instead of typing them and making sure they don't do mistakes. But that's about it. I don't think we'll do more than that.
Okay, then I'll put this as part of the SDK.
Put it as a semantic convention.
Semantic convention. Okay. Okay, cool. I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.